people, and I'm guilty of this as well, we talked about this, but they find something that worked for them or that they really enjoyed. And then instead of that being good enough, it's like they have to validate it to themselves as to why this is the best thing for everyone. And I went through that with flexible dieting, and I'll just tell the story. I used to really struggle with, like when I was like 20, 21, with like binge eating.
Dr. Layne Norton. He's someone that you wouldn't expect to see on my channel, right? The thing is, when you look at science, when you look at content, when you look at humanity, we all have to grow, right? We have to look at different sides of the equation. And sure, Layne and I have things that we don't agree on. But Layne is someone that has spent years and years and years in the nutrition profession, is a PhD in nutrition, and he definitely knows how the body works. So I have to give credit where credit is due, and I wanted to bring him on because I want to talk about some things, because I think there's really common ground, especially when you start looking at thermodynamics and how thermodynamics still can, or ultimately absolutely do, apply even when you're in ketosis or when you're intermittent fasting and whatnot. So I wanted to be able to expand things and have a productive discussion so that we can take some really awesome gems of knowledge that Layne has, combined with some of the things that I've learned over 10 years of doing keto, and really help people just get the most out of it. So without further ado, let's bring Dr. Layne Norton on. We're gonna do this via Zoom. Hopefully it's good quality, and let's rock and roll. Okay, so I've got Dr. Layne Norton here, which is awesome to have you. Thanks for coming on, Layne.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. And you know, it's kind of funny just to give context. I mean, you and I have a little bit of history. I mean, I know it's, I'd say what, 4 or 5 years ago, probably at the height of it, you called me out on some things. And at the time it was frustrating because here I am building a brand, just being like, why is this guy picking on me? I'm like you, I was someone that was bullied in high school. So it's like, I take it super personal. And we'll kind of get into the details of that, but I've tried to come a long way with my brand and start looking at things from a different angle and understanding that, perhaps earlier in my career, I was more, a little too cavalier, understanding the biochemistry to a certain degree and making my own kind of claims from it. And I've actually even deleted videos that I think don't align with where I stand today. And part of it is the evolution, right? Just me understanding a little bit more how the human body works, B, what works for me. But I wanted to bring you on because it's like, you are, in some people's eyes, you would be like the opposite of what I talk about. But I think there's actually a lot of commonality when we kind of come together and talk about these things. So, but I want you to introduce yourself. Give people some context, because you were a nutrition PhD, you're the real deal. No matter what people in the low carb or fasting community might say, you're the real deal.
Yeah, I would say that your viewers this might be the last person they expect on the other end of the line when they pull up the video. But no, we've had a few discussions on like over Instagram DMs and whatnot. And one of the things I respect about you is you've always been super cordial, even if I haven't been in the past, which I appreciate. And, I think we were talking about this before we went on. To me, if I'm not willing to like let people change their minds or have a new views or reach across the aisle, as it were, then I'm just going to continue to talk to my own echo chamber, and it just beat a dead horse, and it's not going to help anybody.
Yeah.
And so I actually am really excited to be on here with you, because I do think it'll help a large amount of people, and give people some more insights into understanding that I'm actually not against low carb diets, and I'm not against keto. I just, when it comes to any sort of diet, I just want those to be promoted responsibly, and not make, some of the claims that are out there. Yeah. So just for those who might not be familiar with me and my background, you mentioned that you were bullied when you were younger. The same applies for me. That's how I got into weightlifting. And I always joke that I got into lifting weights to stop getting bullied and get attention from girls, and it didn't do either of those things. But I did fall in love with lifting weights. And when I got to college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I thought I wanted to be a marine biologist, but after getting into bodybuilding and knowing I wanted to be in the sciences, I switched my major to biochemistry. Graduated with a degree in biochemistry after 4 years, and then went and did a PhD in nutritional sciences. My area of specificity was actually protein metabolism, but I did quite a bit of work with body composition and fat loss as well. And then along the way, I like I said, I describe myself as putting a 6 of one, half dozen of the other, a meathead who loves science or a science geek who loves to lift heavy stuff. And, along the way, turned pro in natural bodybuilding, turned pro in powerlifting, won 2 national titles in powerlifting, and also was a runner-up at Worlds and set a then squat world record in 2015, as well as a silver medal overall in the World Championships. So have had, I guess, if I had to pick out something that makes me unique, is I have the educational background, but I've also, applied it to myself, and then I've coached over 2,000 people over about a 15-year period. And so I guess there's not a lot of people with that sort of perspective of having the academics and having the personal application, and also having applied it to a bunch of other people. So I feel like some of the topics I kind of have a unique perspective on, and I'm happy to share those.
Yeah, awesome. And I definitely I want my audience to be able to learn from you. I don't want this to be one of those situations where we're both just kind of beating a dead horse with it. We're actually learning, because I have a lot to learn. I'm not a nutrition PhD. I mean, this is something that my experience with keto has been my own 10-year experience, and sort of working backwards from there and just kind of falling in love with the mechanistic actions, or what seemed to be, and how it works with me. I think one of the things that I could learn a lot from you in regard to is the whole fructose conversation. And it's been one that has been a topic of debate throughout the low carb community. But most of my experience surrounding fructose comes from purely the ketogenic side, how fructose affects ketogenesis, not so much how it affects other realms, right? And there's so much, really is conflicting data. And one of the things that I respect about you is you are very picky on study design. And I think that's sort of, as far as I'm concerned, like that's my next evolution of learning is, okay, rather than just understanding evidence-based nutrition, let's actually take a look at how these studies were designed. And you look at some studies and you see, okay, yes, there's going to be these increases in different enzymatic activity that's going to ultimately increase more triglyceride content with fructose consumption. But then when you actually look at the data, you see that it's not controlled for calories, and that can... So anyway, I just want to kind of what's like the 60-second sort of elevator pitch on fructose metabolism and how it potentially goes through, conversion to fat, de novo lipogenesis. Like, where do we stand right now as of 2021?
Yeah, so fructose is a little bit unique in that it's mostly metabolized in the liver. There is fructokinase in the intestines as well as the kidneys, but the majority of the metabolism is in the liver. And there was some thought for a period of time that, and this is still pervasive on social media, is that fructose could contribute to fatty liver disease. If you look at the research on fatty liver, if you overfeed fructose, yes, you can develop fatty liver. But there was actually a study that compared overfeeding saturated fat versus overfeeding fructose, same calories, and actually found that saturated fat increased liver fat 70% more than fructose did. So
Wow.
They both increased liver fat, but saturated fat actually increased it way more. And so when I've brought that to different, some low carb advocate doctors out there who also advocate that saturated fat isn't that bad for you, I'm like, okay, well, I grant you that if you overfeed fructose, it will increase liver fat. But then how do you say that saturated fat is okay if you're beating the horse about fructose being bad when straight up saturated fat increased liver fat 70% more? And by the way, I'm not saying you can't have saturated fat either. If you overfeed calories from anything, you increase liver fat. And
Yeah.
the studies are pretty clear on that. And getting back to study design, I mean, when almost 99% of the time, when somebody sends me a study and says, how do you explain this? And it's always a study that seems to go against, the things I've said. Almost 99% of the time, I can look at the study design, I can look at the results, I can look at the statistics and say, okay, well, here's why they found this. You have to understand the question you're asking. Then you have to design a study that can actually answer that question. And then you really got to go through and say, is this what the data is actually telling me? And I don't want to kind of pitch an ivory tower scenario where I'm just saying, well, if you don't have a PhD, then you don't know anything, because that's not true. But it is really, really difficult to read and interpret studies unless you have a long history of doing so.
Yeah.
And trying to pick out, differences in study design, or even right down to, looking at methodology and saying, well, actually, based on what you're wanting to measure, the method you're using isn't even appropriate and validated for what you're trying to measure. So I think that's really, really difficult and difficult to convey.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I try to do on my YouTube, is say, okay, well, here's this study. Here's what they found. Here's what their conclusion was. Here's why I agree or disagree with their conclusion based on what their data says. And when it comes to something like, let's take fructose again. What is the actual question? Does fructose cause fatty liver? If you overfeed it, yes. But I think one of the things I always tell people to ask question-wise is, compared to what?
Yeah.
Because nutrition, if you're eating a lot of something or you're eating less of something, then by default, you're probably going to eat more of something else.
True.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So we have to look at what you're replacing with that. Now, if we look at, for example, when they do studies where they remove sugar-sweetened beverages or they add sugar-sweetened beverages, they show increases and decreases in liver fat. And I mean, that's very important.
Yeah.
But when they do the same studies and they equate for calories, they don't really see differences. I mean, even with something like high fructose corn syrup, if you equate calories, you just don't see differences in liver fat. Now, that being said, that is not, kind of abdicating sugar-sweetened beverages of their responsibility in the obesity epidemic, because at the end of the day, people don't drink a Coke or a soft drink or a pop or whatever the listener, wherever you're at, the region, what they call it. Where I grew up, it was soft drinks, but you don't drink one of those and say, well, that was 40 grams of carbohydrate, so I'm going to have a smaller serving of pasta at dinner, right? Like, people don't do that. They're actually typically drinking this on top of stuff that they're already eating. So that's it.
Yeah,
The question is not as straightforward, right? It's, does it do this? Yes, it can. But if the question is it uniquely lipogenic or is it uniquely fattening to the body or the liver, then the evidence suggests that probably not on a per calorie basis.
Yeah.
But, I mean, again, drinking a soda is a lot different than eating an apple, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So,
and you're also talking, when someone drinks a soda, that's a very large proportion of high fructose corn syrup that someone is consuming. So if they're drinking 3 or 4 sodas a day, to the naked eye, you look at that and that would definitely demonstrate, okay, yes, it looks like this high fructose corn syrup is causing the problem, when in reality, just as a proportion to everything else, it's just become the lion's share just by default, just because of how they're consuming it. But also, you can't discount the hyperpalatability effect. I mean, what else is that leading to, right? I mean, the blood sugar crash that comes after that, and what are they eating after that? And I think another thing that's interesting about high fructose corn syrup, and I just want to make sure it's clear on my channel, because I think people think that high fructose corn syrup is pure fructose. I think it's like 60-40, right? Like 60 fructose, 40, something like that.
Depends on the high fructose corn syrup, but generally the average is about 55-45. So 55 fructose and 45 glucose. And so what's funny is when people get upset with me for debunking some things, what they don't realize is I probably believed in whatever they believed in at some point. And I think just the process of going through grad school and having so many of my ideas absolutely obliterated by reading research and having my advisor just straight up tell me, that's nonsense and here's why, really made me very skeptical. And I always take a skeptical approach to things. But when it comes to high fructose corn syrup, I was a big believer in the fact that high fructose corn syrup was uniquely fattening. I still remember back in 2003 being on bodybuilding message boards with some more evidence-based or scientific types talking about the mechanisms of fructose contributing to obesity via de novo lipogenesis or not having an impact on leptin and those sorts of things. And I felt very strongly that. And I remember being in 2004, my first year in grad school, I was at a mixer for the Nutritional Science Symposium. And one of the professors who actually did fructose research, he was right across the hall from me. He was talking to another professor, and that professor had said to him, well, I really think that high fructose corn syrup is the cause of, these obesity problems. And the professor who did this research said, I think it's definitely a contributor, but it doesn't appear to be uniquely fattening. And the other professor said, but your own studies showed like liver fat increase in rats that were, fed fructose. He said, yeah, that's because we fed them 70% of their entire diet from fructose. You could not get that even if you tried.
Yeah.
Literally, like if you had 100% of your calories from fructose, from sugar sweetened beverages, you still wouldn't get to 70% fructose from calories. So I think it's important to understand a lot of times, especially in animal research, a lot of times we use animal research just to say, okay, can we induce an effect? Is there something weird that happens when we do X, right? So if we do X, does Y happen? And since we know it's possible, then we go, okay, now what happens if we do it more physiologically? And then if we still do it in a rat or a mouse or whatever, and we still have an effect, then we say, okay, well, now let's test it in humans. That tends to be the progression of how things go. And so, unfortunately, people really don't know the differences in levels of evidence, right? So a study comes out in mice that says X, and people go, oh my God, that's it. I got to avoid this thing. But then something comes out in humans and says the opposite. And they say, well, all these studies contradict each other. I don't know what to believe. Well, no, the human randomized control trial is probably a lot better than the rodent study. Now, again, I'm somebody who all my research was in rodents. And I think like rodent model of various things is very, very important. But it can only prompt us to ask the question in humans. And I'm grateful that my research was actually validated later in humans mostly by Stu Phillips, one of the lead protein researchers in the world. But again, we can't really make hard conclusions based on rodent data. There's not only differences in physiology, but you're able to exert a level of control over animals that just doesn't apply to human, like real world interaction, right?
Well, not to mention,
lot of stuff,
ethically, like what you can do, right? It's like, for example, a lot of the anti-aging studies, the longevity studies, it's just flat out, you can't necessarily, you can't really do that with a human because it's however long it would take, but B, even when you're looking at fasting models in rodents for sirtuin activation and things like that, it certainly can make sense, but the data that you're getting from humans, although some of it still seems to line up, it's not the same, because what are you going to do, put someone in a metabolic chamber and starve them for a year? You can't really do that, right? So
right.
It's difficult, and I'm guilty of that too. Getting excited about a rodent model study and shouting it from the rooftops, right? And I think one of the evolutions that I've made over the last year and a half, especially, is making a very clear notation. I still get excited about the research, right? It's just kind of who I am. I'm just an excitable person when it comes to that. But I make sure that I note that, hey, this is a rodent model. Like, absolutely, take note of this. Because as I've evolved, understanding that, and it's like so much of my content is geared towards just that, like the anti-aging piece or the longevity piece in general, and understanding that. And the data is just difficult. It's just tough.
Yeah, and I think, so when can we start to feel confident about various things? Well, I think, if we've got that in vitro research and that seems to agree with the rodent or the animal research, and that seems to agree with the human randomized control trials, and that is pointing towards, the meta-analyses and systematic reviews, and most of those appear to be in alignment, well, then we feel very, very confident, right? And I think that's another thing to understand is, like, you very rarely hear scientists say things like, this proves this, or this is always this way, or never this way, or you don't really hear scientists make those. What they'll say is like, yeah, we feel pretty strongly this, or these data lead us to conclude this, right? It's one of those things where it's kind of like degrees of confidence. One of my friends who's a professor at Ole Miss, his name's Jeremy Lineker, and I'll never forget, he gave a seminar where he said, I have different degrees of confidence in data. So there's some things that I'd be willing to bet my toe on, and there's some things I'd be willing to bet my foot on. There's some things I'd be willing to bet my leg on, and there's some things I'd be willing to bet my life on, right? Yeah. So, you take something like, I'll always do this in all my seminars. My first opener is I'll take a pin and I'll drop it. And I'll say, hey, look, gravity worked again. But by the way, gravity isn't proven. You can't prove anything in science, But we just have enough data points that I know that if I drop this pin, it'll drop towards the earth at 9.8 meters per second. We understand that has had so much validation to it that we're pretty darn confident in it, right? But when it comes to things like, intermittent fasting and longevity, it is, the amount of people that think that is like a clear cut, it absolutely shows that. It is not clear cut at all. Yeah. What it does appear, I tell you what, even the idea that caloric restriction prolongs lifespan is not clear cut in humans. Now, what I would say is clear cut is that, obesity is a risk factor for shortened lifespan and mortality and those sorts of things. Some people would argue with me there's a big push now that you can be healthy and have obesity. And to a certain degree, that is true. Yeah. However, I actually just did a video about this the other day. If you take all things being equal, there was a meta-analysis done where they looked at obese people with healthy blood markers, so no high blood pressure, no off blood lipids, blood glucose fine, blood insulin, basically metabolically healthy obese. And you compared their mortality rates and incidence of cardiovascular disease to people who were not obese but also metabolically healthy. The people who were not obese lived longer and had lower incidence of cardiovascular disease. So again, now that's not saying that those metabolically healthy obese aren't relatively healthy, because they still lived longer than people who were metabolically unhealthy. Yeah. But when things are compared straight up, when we compare apples to apples, you're not going to be as healthy as you could be if you were obese. So back to what I was saying. Sorry, I always like to give a lot of context.
No, you're good. You're good.
Back to what I was saying. It's not clear cut that caloric restriction actually prolongs lifespan in humans, and it's certainly not clear cut that intermittent fasting prolongs lifespan in humans. What appears to be relatively clear cut is if you become overweight or obese and you're that way for a long time, that appears to be a risk factor for shortening your lifespan. Yeah. So there are some, there was a study in monkeys that was pretty well documented where they calorically restricted them for, I believe it was 20% of their initial maintenance calories throughout adulthood, I want to say. And they did see a prolonging of lifespan on average. So to me, what I tell people is like, listen, what the data appears to say to me is try not to become obese. Yeah. And I think that you're going to get the majority of the benefits that way, right? But some of this stuff's going to be really hard to pick out in humans. As you said, you can't throw a human in a metabolic chamber for, a year. Yeah. And that's one of the other things that people don't have a good grasp on is they'll say, well, why didn't this study do this? Or why didn't this study do this? And the answer to your question, my friends, is always money, 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 and money.
Exactly.
So just to give some perspective, if you run a 6-week trial or 4-week trial with probably 10 people in a metabolic chamber, depending on what you're doing, it's going to be well above 6 figures. I mean, probably closer to $500,000, to be honest. So, and I think people have really good handle on that. And it's always like, also, who's going to fund it, right? Yeah. So either the government is going to fund it or it's going to be from private industry. There's very, very, very few self-funded studies. And so that's one of the other big misnomers out there about research is people say, well, the funding source, what is the funding source and this and that. Listen, I can tell you that my research was funded by the Egg Nutrition Center and the National Dairy Council. I met one person from one of those places one time. It was at a conference. The meeting was about 90 seconds, and it went something like this. Thank you so much for funding my research. I really appreciate it. Oh, we appreciate you doing the research. Thank you so much. And that was pretty much it. Now, I had to give them reports every 6 months, but that was pretty much the limit of the interaction. Now, I'm not saying that nefarious things never happen. They certainly do. Yeah. But that's why we don't get excited about one study.
Yeah.
Right? I tell people, I used to get excited about single studies. Now I say, let me see a half dozen of them and a couple of meta-analyses, and then I'll get really excited, right?
Yeah, without a doubt.
Because you can almost always find a single study in isolation to support whatever you want to support. That's why looking at the consensus of the data is really important. And I'm not saying that everyone has to agree with the consensus, but it's important to understand what the consensus is and why it is that way and what the confidence is in that consensus. So, yeah, like I said, I think people have a really hard time differentiating between I don't even want to say a poor quality study, but just, it's like they want every study to be able to answer every question of the universe. And studies aren't designed that way. Studies are designed that they are controlled in such a way that you're answering one, maybe two questions, usually in a very, very narrow window. And I think the problem more so is the over-interpretation of studies by the media and people on social media. Yeah. And again, it's one of those things where, if you guys, those who watch my videos know, I usually don't make really broad claims and sweeping claims just because I know that a study could come out tomorrow that says the exact opposite thing. And it doesn't mean that somebody was paid off or anything like that. It just means that different populations with different methods, with different study designs can produce different results.
Yeah, no, dead on. And I mean, even with, the intermittent fasting piece, like kind of coming back to that, it's, even if we could say with more certainty that it does increase lifespan, we're not necessarily saying that intermittent fasting itself is doing the magic, right? It's not, it could be the fact that if you take a large amount of people that are intermittent fasting, even though they say they're not, there's a good chance they're probably restricting calories. I know it's the case with me, right? If I log and I track and I really try to unconsciously just track and not really think about it, making changes, yeah, I'm usually putting myself in a deficit. And I try to explain this on my channel, and sometimes I get backlash for it, but yes, you could probably make some claims and say, yeah, I feel that intermittent fasting is good for longevity and good for lifespan. And if you back that data out, then you probably find that, there's probably a caloric deficit at play as well, alongside a bunch of other things. And it's not to say that it doesn't necessarily work, but it's just like you're saying, it's not absolute. We can't say this is the case or this is not the case. We have a bunch of other factors that are at play here. Okay, if intermittent fasting works because they're potentially reducing their caloric intake, and maybe they're lighter and feeling better, and maybe they're losing weight as a result of that, then maybe that's what's prolonging lifespan. And how many different levels of intricacy do we have to have before we have confidence in that? And the stuff with longevity is so difficult because we're just now starting to look at that really aggressively anyway. So we're still decades away from having any more I don't even want to say concrete, because just like you said, you can't really get it concrete, but we're still decades away from even scratching the tip of the surface with it. And I know that's something that you address a lot, and I think people automatically assume that you're anti-intermittent fasting because you default it back to caloric restriction. I mean, there's things at play, without a doubt, but I still tell people that with intermittent fasting, not to kind of digress, but kind of coming back to it, and the large majority of the results that you're having are probably from caloric restriction. But if it works for you, then by all means, freaking do it, because that's great. If that is how your brain works, then awesome. There's a lot of different reasons that I like to intermittent fast, and some of it is lifestyle, some of it is brain, it's just how I feel mentally, especially when I'm filming and things like that. But then if you also look at the data, you see that people that are intermittent fasting, they still go through the same metabolic slowdown as people that are just doing a standard 20 or 25% deficit, where they have 8-10 weeks and they're having a pretty significant reduction in their basal metabolic rate. So that implies that, okay, yeah, you're still kind of falling into that same bucket, right? I think it's important to address that. It's something I try to say in my videos more recently, but the YouTube algorithm makes sure that not everyone sees your content all the time, so it's hard to get that message across to everybody.
Tell me about it. Yeah, I think sorry, I dropped my pen. I think you bring up a really interesting point. We talked about this a little bit before we got started. I think what people struggle with is, first thing, they make associations that maybe they're associating the wrong thing. I'll give you an example. I had a client a long time ago who swore that they were gluten intolerant. So if I have gluten, I blow up. I said, okay. And like, you know, I have no reason to not believe them, but I started talking to them and dug a little bit deeper. And it turned out really the only time they were having gluten was when they were pretty much binge eating on a cheat meal, right? Whether it was pizza or hamburgers or whatever it was. And I said, okay, well, let's just try this, okay? I want you to, you know, they'd been kind of tracking their calories a little bit. I said, I want you to eat 2 slices of bread today, and I want you to document what happens. And the next day I got an email saying, oh my God, I ate bread that didn't bloat me. And I said, well, yeah, you know, it makes sense. You know, if the only time you're consuming this was when you were, you know, having 5,000 calories from pizza, then absolutely. I mean, but so they were, whenever they would cut out gluten, they would feel like they made more progress, but it wasn't because of the gluten itself. It was because they were limiting calories by default, and they were also choosing less hyperpalatable foods.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think, so people make the wrong associations, and then also people, and I'm guilty of this as well, we talked about this, but they find something that worked for them or that they really enjoyed. And then instead of that being good enough, it's like they have to validate it to themselves as to why this is the best thing for everyone.
Yeah.
And I went through that with flexible dieting, and I'll just tell the story. I used to really struggle with, like when I was like 20, 21 with like binge eating, because back then the big thing was eating clean, right? So you just, in terms of like the typical bodybuilder menu, you know, egg whites and oatmeal in the morning, chicken breasts, broccoli and rice all day, and, you know, not a whole lot else.
Yeah.
And what I found was that, like, you know, when I got exposed to foods that were outside of that meal plan, I would just end up binge eating on them.
Yeah.
And I kind of came to the point where I'm like, you know, I feel like it's probably not the one slice of pizza that's killing my progress. I feel like it's probably the fact that when I have one slice, I also have the whole pizza. So I started saying, well, let me try and track my macros and just incorporate some of these treats so I don't feel so deprived, but still hit my calories. And I found that, like, for me, it was like, it didn't even feel like dieting anymore. It just felt easy, right? But I recognize that not everybody's the same in that way. But some people, you know, depending on who you talk to, they'll tell you, man, I tried every diet, and when I did low carb, I felt so good. I didn't feel like I was dieting. It felt easy to me. Same thing for intermittent fasting, you know, go pick whichever. And when I had this experience with flexible dieting, I felt like, well, this is the solution for everybody.
Yeah.
Like, if everybody just tracks their macros and hits and still can have the foods that they want, you're like, this will fix everything. And, you know, come to find out that, of course, that wasn't the solution for everybody. And we hear the term, you know, you got to find what works for you.
Yeah.
And I think people inherently believe that when it's what works for you, they think that every person is so physiologically different that you're like finding that magic key to your lock, right? That's for your own, unlocking your body's own physiology. I got to tell you, there's a few studies that have looked at like different genetic differences, especially the Diet Fit study where they looked at insulin secretion and randomized people. They allotted people based on their levels of insulin secretion, based on their genetic profile, into higher carb groups. And they basically found it didn't make a difference at all in fat loss. So, but what I think does make a difference is your personal preference. What feels easy to you, and what feels easy appears to be very, very individually dependent.
Yeah.
So I know people who say, listen, I know you like to track your macros and stuff. That stresses me out. Like, that gives me so much anxiety and like, I hate doing it and, you know, this and that. But if I intermittent fast, you know, I don't overeat. I feel fine. You know, I feel good. It feels easy. And so, you know, for me, and then other people will say, oh, I tried intermittent fasting. What happened was I just ended up binge eating the rest of the day because I was so hungry, right?
Very common.
And so it's, if you want to lose fat, you have to restrict yourself in some way. Yeah. So to me, what the key is finding the method of restriction that feels the least restrictive for you.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of that boils down to individual psychology and personal preference.
100%.
But that's not really sexy, and people don't like to hear that. They want that. What's the magic fat burning diet? Well,
fortunately, I think it is becoming sexier. I mean, I actually am noticing that I think people that are taking this unbelievably religious dogmatic approach towards one specific avenue are slowly getting kind of ousted. I really am seeing it happening, and it's just, I think it's becoming cooler to take a better, like, overall holistic look at the whole thing. And one of the things with, I guess, why I like intermittent fasting fundamentally for me is that I feel like I experiment on myself all the time. I'm not always doing keto. People that are at least veterans of my channel know that I'm keto maybe 7 months out of the year. I rotate in different things and I try different things. Intermittent fasting is one of those things where, okay, since it's a timing system, I can still apply it to whatever I want to do. And from a content perspective, it lends itself great because I can have essentially endless content on my own self-experimentation where I'm like, okay, I'm going to try intermittent fasting plus vegan. I'm going to try intermittent fasting with paleo. I'm going to try intermittent fasting with keto. And I'll report what works for me. And it's fun. And I think that's the operative word, right? Like, for people that are in the fitness industry or in the health industry or in the nutrition industry, it does kind of have to be fun to keep you going at it. And you said it perfectly. Why is that not enough sometimes? Why is just a passion not enough? Like, it's, I think one of the things that you mentioned to me that you had liked about my approach before is that, like, I don't have a problem just saying that this is what works for me and this is what I like. And before I used to preach it as gospel, and now it's a lot more of, hey, I like this. If you want to join me, and I'll share the details of it, and we can have some fun with it. But it's that lack of taking a big picture approach and just understanding that, like, what you can adhere to and what works for your psychology is a big piece. I mean, I will say there's some interesting stuff, and I'm curious your opinion on this, like, legitimately, with microbiome and glucose utilization and fatty acid oxidation, short chain fatty acids, as far as bioindividuality is concerned, because I think like, fundamentally we're all very similar. Some obviously differences with maybe gene expression and certain things there, but I mean, again, we're just scratching the surface. Who knows? But it's kind of looking interesting. But the microbiome is so dang hard to research, so dang hard to back anything up with. I mean, just curious, like, where kind of the research stands now. Do you think that could be playing a role in how people are, like, some people are better at metabolizing glucose and some people aren't, and so forth?
So to answer your question, yeah, I think that absolutely probably plays a role. How big that role is and how much we can actually modulate that in order to act as a therapeutic remains to be seen, right? So unfortunately, what tends to happen in the fitness industry is it's like, okay, we've identified the microbiome plays a role, and now you all must buy my probiotic because it's going to fix your gut microbiome and increase your insulin. And it's like, no, we don't know that. In fact, there's some evidence that if you already have a healthy gut microbiome, which most people, or if you're eating reasonably and getting enough fiber in, you probably do have a healthy gut microbiome. Oh, by the way, just because you have gas and bloating, by the way, doesn't mean that you have an unhealthy gut.
Yeah,
that's one of the big things. In fact, if you're getting enough prebiotic fiber to gut microbiome, you probably should have some gas, to be quite honest.
The literal definition of fiber is FDA, it has to be a fermentable demonstrable, which literally means it's breaking down into gas.
Make gas. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people, it's easy for charlatans to kind of try and sell this because, like, oh, if you have, and they list off a bunch of symptoms that pretty much every single person has at some time in their life. But back to the original question, I do think it absolutely plays a role. In fact, one of my lab mates during my PhD, she was doing her master's. Her name's Suzanne Devkota, and she's actually one of the leading researchers on the gut microbiome. And she's doing some fascinating stuff. She's out in California, actually. If you ever want, I can put you in touch with her.
That'd be awesome.
And we had her out to our office, and we did like a podcast with her, interview, and those sorts of things. I mean, she basically, so one of the funny things was the first thing we got in, we said, hey, do you want something to drink? She's like, yeah, I'll take a Diet Coke. So she's drinking a Diet Coke on our interview, and these people in the YouTube comments are like, she's obviously not a gut microbiome. That is destroying her gut microbiome, this and that. And it's like, do you really think you know more than somebody who's actually researching this topic? So, by the way, all the human randomized control trials on diet soda don't show any difference in the gut microbiome. That doesn't seem to affect, at least in the doses given that humans consume, doesn't affect them. So
yeah, that's definitely what I have noticed. And I've been
bottoms up.
I've been someone I've been someone that's demonized artificial sweeteners before. I'm definitely have, and I still do to some degree. But I have definitely realized that the dosages that we're given are pretty extreme, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at a normal, healthy person, yeah, it's, first of all, and also the data is extremely confusing. Like, it's not all the way down to like the cephalic insulin response. Like, that piece, that could already be dictated by how your microbiome is to begin with, not necessarily the artificial sweeteners' effect on it, right? The cephalic insulin response, like what saccharin is the one that seems to show, but it's just so difficult because some people, it's like split down the middle, right? Acid, sulfate, potassium, same kind of thing. It's like some see cephalic insulin response, some don't. And I've tried to make that clear in videos that, if you're wearing a CGM or something, then maybe that can give you some data on yourself. And actually, before I forget too, when you were talking about kind of that bio-individualism, kind of that piece, there was also an interesting study that I remember, it was like 800 different participants and they all plugged them into a CGM. What was interesting was, some had crazy high glucose spikes to cookies, some didn't. Some had crazy high spikes with bananas, some didn't. But the end, and that was, in the moment, right? But at the end of the day, at the end of the study, the overall kind of weight loss and ultimate results were about the same. So that's what I find interesting. If you're getting down to like a super granular level and maybe you want to just kind of, play biohacker with yourself, and then you got to just test yourself, but take it for what it's worth, because what you test today is probably going to be different from what you test 3 days from now. And if you want to drive yourself crazy by trying to figure out everything that's going on, be my guest. I do, and it literally makes me crazy sometimes. But I guess the point is that, yeah, when you look, especially at body composition, there's a lot of different ways to get to the same end result. And
yes.
I kind of just come in full circle back to, I guess, the original piece. And I want to be respectful of time. And one of the things that I really wanted to help get across to my viewers, and again, I'm going to
before you go on, let me just address that last piece real quick, Thomas, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
I think one of the reasons that, so two things I want to address. The first one is the reason a lot of people are actually gravitating towards personal preferences, you said earlier, is because if you just pay attention, you can tell that some of these people just, what they're saying can't be true, because they'll say things like, oh, if you're eating carbs, you can't lose fat or you can't burn fat. Yeah. And then you see an athlete who's eating 500 grams of carbs a day who gets shredded. Or you see somebody who loses 200 pounds and they said, yeah, I had 200 grams of carbohydrate a day. And it's like, okay, well, that can't possibly be, if what you're saying is true, that can't be true. Then you'll have vegans who say, oh, if you eat meat, it causes all these inflammatory things and like X, Y, Z. And it's like, okay, well, if that was true, then how is these people who are doing carnivore get this, right? Yep. So I think you said it. There's many paths to Rome. It doesn't mean they're all equal paths, but there are many paths to health. Yeah. And maybe you're not on the perfect path, but a non-perfect path. By the way, we're all on the non-perfect path because nobody knows what the perfect path is, right? And the non-perfect path that still gets you 90% of the way there is a lot better than just getting frustrated and not doing anything. So I think, again, it's always compared to what, right?
Yeah. No, it's a very good point.
And then getting back to the gut microbiome, I mean, basically talking to Suzanne, she said, what we understand right now is the following. Don't become obese, exercise, eat enough fiber, and don't eat too much saturated fat. And that seems to be the things that we understand right now for a healthy microbiome. And it possibly may affect calories in, calories out. And this gets to a larger discussion, but people don't really understand what calories in, calories out is. They think, oh, I'm tracking my calories in and I'm tracking my calories out, and that's calories in, calories out.
Good luck. What your Apple Watch says is not your actual calories out.
That's correct. These overestimate by about 25 to 95%, depending on the product. But, a great example, people say, well, gut microbiome, the calories in, calories out doesn't account for that. Actually, it does, Because if your gut microbiome is a specific flora, that perhaps you're able to extract more calories out of the food you eat.
Precisely.
And absorb more calories. Well, that's more calories in.
Yeah.
Or perhaps it's having an impact on energy expenditure. Well, that's calories out, right? So no matter what you want to pick up, whether it's hormones or anything, just take your pick. If it's having an effect on fat loss, it's going to be somewhere in that calories in, calories out sides of the equation.
Absolutely. Yep.
But those are very, very hard to assess. And that's one of the things we try to keep. Just like, keeping a budget is a great tool, even though you can never know exactly where all your money is at any one given time, right? And then you throw in things like interest rates and inflation and all that kind of stuff. But just because you can't track it perfectly doesn't mean it's not a really useful tool for helping you figure out where your money's going, right? Yeah. And I kind of use that same example with tracking your calories.
Yeah, no, that's and I don't want to turn this into like a pitch or anything like that, but I will say, like, just as a side note, like Carbon, your tracking app is awesome, and so if people are looking for like an app to track, like MyNetDiary, MyFitnessPal are awesome, but there's some huge flaws that I can find with them. And again, I don't want to turn this into a pitch, and this wasn't sponsored by Carbon, anything like that. I will just say, like, as far as like keto, fasting, whatever, if you're tracking, like, kudos to you. I think that's kind of how I was able to cross over a threshold and feel like, okay, I actually like really respect this app. So it was actually your app that kind of turned my way of thinking a little bit in terms of that evolution. So just FYI, I'll link out to it down below, but this is not sponsored in part by them, nothing like that. This is honestly just my own opinion on it. And I will say on the calories in, calories out thing, how I've kind of described it, which again, I catch a lot of flack for, is, I mean, it's still at the end of the day, think of trying to like make it as colloquial as I can, but if you have a forest fire burning, okay, forest fire is burning. Sure, you might have different terrain, hormones, right? You might have the wind, you might have humidity. It doesn't change the fact that the fire is still burning, right? And it might influence it in certain ways, but it's not changing the math. It's just, it's altering it to some degree, but you're still measuring the fire. And trying to explain that, okay, there's different arguments out there with keto and resting metabolic rate and things like that, and some of them are very flawed study design, I will admit, like, don't want to call out names a whole lot, but the Ludwig study and stuff like that, yes, one could argue that, yeah, maybe there's some more brown fat respiration and you burn more calories on keto. Okay, let's, outside of picking that apart, let's just say that is 100% the case or 99% the case. Even if that was the case, it does not change the fact. In fact, it even demonstrates even more that calories do matter, right? Because if you're making a statement that, okay, on keto, you're gonna burn more calories at rest, if you're making that statement, then right in that very statement, you are saying that calories are important and that they matter and that it's, and I think a lot of what's unfortunate, and I don't want to bag on my, the keto community here, but this is where I've sort of branched off from them a little bit, and I catch flack, right? Because I try to look at things as much as I can in different angles. I know what works for me, but you cannot deny physics and math. Like, you cannot deny that. That is, there are lots of different things that are going to influence that, and a lot of people in the keto community will only rein on the calories in, calories out model because they're just so stuck on Carb-Insulin model, which has some interesting pieces to it, but it's still part of a bigger equation. And I don't think that people, even like people that are taking a look at the Carb-Insulin theory and understanding that to the 10th degree, I think the respectable people within that world still understand that calories in, calories out matters. And I want to give you an opportunity to kind of explain that in a, I guess, a helpful way, because I feel like people that do keto, they have a tendency to forget it. They get, just by very nature, people that do keto like to get wrapped up in the nuancy stuff. I found that with myself too. It's just, maybe
Diggers.
Yeah, exactly. And so they tend to like overthink these certain things. And I still try to say, like, within that respectable macronutrient range, there still needs to be like a deficit. You can't be eating, that deficit's going to be hard for you to determine, because yes, let's say for a minute that keto does change that. That just makes it more difficult because then you're not sure where you're at. But I want, you to explain it in maybe a way that might be helpful for people that are doing keto, because I still think it's very important, obviously.
Yeah, if you don't mind indulging me, I'm just gonna I'm going to have my first correction for you on our coaching app, which, so it does have a tracker in it, but the primary function of the app for people listening is actually to coach you on nutrition. So, basically it will give you, based on your goal, based on, your individual metabolism and the inputs you put in, it'll give you macronutrient recommendations, and then it will adjust them each week based on how you're progressing. And we even have, it's funny when people say that I'm anti-keto or anti-low carb. If you look at the options for the different diet types, we have an option for ketogenic and for low carb. So low carb would be, not quite necessarily ketogenic, although some of them probably do slip into that area. But yeah, like it's been an awesome tool. And even people have said, wow, just tracking, even if you're not using the coaching portion of it, which I would tell anybody the coaching portion is worth it alone. But just tracking, people become mind blown by, wow, I didn't realize what was in this, right?
Yeah.
Or I didn't realize how much I was actually eating. And there's studies, and people get really offended by this. And I don't think there's any reason to get offended, but they show that people in studies underreport their food intake by 30 to 50%.
Yeah.
They overreport their activity by 50%. There was a study, I want to say it was in 96, a metabolic ward study where they had people come in who self-reported not being able to lose weight on 1,200 calories a day. And they told them, we're going to be able to know what you're eating. Like we will know. If you're not reporting accurately, we will know. So they underreported by 50%, overreported their activity by 50%. And they actually argued with the researchers about how much they were eating, which is pretty hilarious if you think about it. And a lot of people say, well, people lie. And I don't even think it's necessarily lying. I think a lot of people are really ignorant of portion sizes, right?
Yeah.
So, guys, if you've never had the experience of like weighing out everything you put in your mouth for like a week, even if you never do it again, it's really enlightening. And if you want to be depressed, go and weigh out a serving of ice cream. Go weigh out a serving of nuts. Or peanut butter, or cereal. Like you'll be like, wow. So actually what I thought was a serving was actually 3 or 4. Yeah. So those are really important things to keep in mind, is that if you've never had that experience, and the other thing is people like grab handfuls of stuff throughout the day, and that's not something that registers, right? Like they just grab it, mindlessly eat it. That can add up to hundreds of calories a day.
If you eat out of the bulk bin section at Whole Foods, it doesn't count towards your calories.
Exactly. But getting to your question, the carb-insulin model, I'm going to do a really quick and dirty recap of the most current version of the carb-insulin model, because it has changed a few times. But basically, what the carb-insulin model proposes is that we don't become fat because we overeat. We overeat because we become fat, and we become fat because we eat too many refined carbohydrates. This raises our insulin levels. Insulin inhibits lipolysis, which traps fat in fat cells, making it inaccessible to the rest of the body. Since those fat stores are not accessible to the rest of the body, we overeat in response to that.
Yeah. And
also there's an element of, I know Ludwig's version has kind of insulin reducing your total daily energy expenditure, that sort of thing. And, I think you mentioned Ludwig's studies, and those were probably the most, I would say over the last 4 years, are the most compelling studies for people that want to say, aha, see, here you go. So I do want to address those. But first I'll address the carb-insulin model a little bit more broadly. So, okay, any of those things could be true. But if they are true, if all things are equal and we match diets in calories, we should see that diets that are higher in refined carbohydrates, regardless of being matched in calories, that those should produce either less fat loss or more fat gain. I think that's unequivocally a fact for the carb-insulin model to be true. As of now, we have, I believe, 22 controlled feeding studies. When I say controlled, I mean it was either a metabolic ward or the food was provided to participants, where they measure energy expenditure and or body composition. And what we see is the summation of those studies is virtually no difference in body composition and virtually no difference in energy expenditure when calories and protein are equated. And that is even with, differences in insulin levels in many of these studies. And in fact, even in some studies, I'm thinking of Surwitt et al. Back from 2001, I want to say, they compared big differences in glycemic index diets. So they had one diet that was totally equated in macros. All the macros were equal. And the only difference was one diet was over 100 grams of sugar a day in the form of sucrose, and the other diet was about 10 grams. So we're talking about a tenfold difference in sugar. I mean, that's pretty extreme. And if we would expect to see something. And I believe it was an obese. I could be wrong, but I believe it was an obese. And both groups lost the exact same amount of weight, exact same amount of fat, and almost all their blood markers improved to a similar extent. The only one that was a little bit different was LDL cholesterol improved more in the low glycemic diet, but that was probably because they were higher in fiber.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's one part of it. So that we don't see those differences. And the other part of it is the most effective drug we have for treating obesity is a drug called semaglutide. And there's another one in the family called liraglutide. Both those drugs are GLP-1 mimetics that increase insulin levels. And so if the carb-insulin model is true and you're giving a drug that increases insulin, at least in the short term, because Gary Taubes has argued that, well, if you look after, the end of these people, like their diets or the end of their treatments, their insulin levels are lower. But that's because they lose a huge amount of weight. That's why their basal insulin levels drop. But initially, when they give these GLP-1 mimetics, it raises their insulin.
Yeah.
And based on the carb-insulin model, that should result in fat gain. But it doesn't. They actually lose, I think the average amount of weight loss is around 10 to 15% of body weight, which is really substantial.
Yeah.
And so again, and by the way, it's through appetite suppression. These people just, they eat less. Yeah. So, but again, that's insulin is, according to the carb-insulin model, is supposed to stimulate hunger. So again, you're giving something that, all things being equal, increases your insulin levels. You would expect more calorie consumption and less energy expenditure, but you don't see either of those things.
Yeah, and when you look at the even the basics of it, I can see that you can see where both sides are coming from. But I mean, just at the very basics of it, if insulin is elevated shortly after a meal, then it would make sense that that's going to drive down appetite like that. So I can see, obviously where they're coming from with that. I live in that community, so I see it all the time. But then when you look at, okay, here's what happens after you eat food, and here's your insulin response, and then here's the subsequent, insulin drop and glucagon. It's okay. You could look at both sides, right? So it's like, because I often say that, like after a meal, when insulin has come back down and glucagon, like during that period of time when you're hungry, at least in the fitness world, I'm saying like, okay, that is a nice opportune time where you're losing weight. If you're hungry, I don't want to say you're automatically losing weight, but it's kind of an indicator, right? When glucagon is perking up and you're kind of getting this, you're probably at that point in time, which when you look at that data, it's a little bit confusing, and it's part of it's maybe me, maybe I'm not understanding it all the way, but with carb-insulin model, there's some holes that I definitely would poke in it, as far as that is concerned too. Like it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense that every time we eat, we're stopping everything, because that would imply that if I were to consume a grain of rice like every 10 minutes or something, hypothetically, right, that I wouldn't lose weight or wouldn't lose fat. So I think there's a lot of holes to be poked and a lot of ground to be covered there.
Yeah, I think appetite in and of itself is extremely complicated. I took a 6-month module on appetite as a graduate student and left basically saying we have no idea about appetite. We tried to say, well, insulin maybe does this. Well, it looks like insulin may be involved in suppressing appetite and stimulating appetite. Glucagon, kind of the same thing. A lot of it depends on the overall hormonal milieu that's present.
That's a good
and the
point.
situation that's in. There's also sociological inputs. There's psychological inputs. It's extremely complicated. I still don't feel like the research has a good grasp on the overall holistic view of what increases or decreases appetite. We feel like we know some things, but we're very far behind on that literature. Yeah. As for the carbohydrate insulin model, I think getting into these studies, so there are some studies that showed that if you fed a low carb diet, there was an increase in energy expenditure and relative to a higher carb diet. And I think what's really important, again, is to point out study design and why it's so important. So when we want to measure total daily energy expenditure in a large population, we do it using what's called doubly labeled water. Now, doubly labeled water means there is a stable isotope label on the hydrogen as well as the oxygen of water. And stable isotopes allow us to basically trace, it's called a metabolic tracer, where these labels are going, because we can look at the concentrations of them on what's called a GCMS, which is a gas chromatography mass spectroscopy unit. It's actually what I used to measure protein synthesis for my graduate school work. We used a metabolic tracer. So I'm actually pretty familiar with this kind of stuff. The problem with doubly labeled water is you have to understand that it's what's called a surrogate measure. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Doubly labeled water is validated against metabolic chamber. So metabolic chamber is a direct measurement of metabolic rate. So that is your direct measurement. And so in order to figure out if doubly labeled water is accurate, they measured it against metabolic chamber and found a correlation of about an R of 0.8, which isn't perfect, but pretty good. That would be like saying, well, calipers are validated against DEXA, right? DEXA is the most direct measurement of body fat that we know of, other than somebody dying and then you excising their fat tissue.
Yeah. Exactly.
So that's important to understand, a surrogate measurement versus the direct measurement. Now, one of the problems with doubly labeled water is in low carb diets, it has not been validated. And in fact, there's some evidence that it overestimates energy expenditure in people on low carb diets. And this appears to be because it causes you to produce more CO2 than we would predict. And that production of CO2, which is one of the ways you get the label of the oxygen out, that production of CO2 is part of the equation that goes into determining your total daily energy expenditure. So why is this all important? Well, there was a study that was done at Harvard where they looked at, okay, we're going to have people lose weight, and then we are going to randomize them to 3 different groups, maintenance groups, where they're going to get different levels of carbohydrate. So they either had 20% of calories from carbohydrate, 40%, or 60%. And they showed that from the lowest level of carbohydrate to the highest level of carbohydrate, there was about a 400 calorie per day difference in energy expenditure. Sounds really impressive, really awesome. But once again, doubly labeled water is not validated against for low carb diets.
Yeah.
Now, in fact, in one study where they did metabolic chamber versus doubly labeled water for low carb diets, the R correlation was only 0.5, which is much weaker than a 0.8.
Yeah.
Now, let's take all that away. Let's say there was this increase in energy expenditure. If there was a real increase in total daily energy expenditure, we'd expect that to show up in a few different places. Either their basal metabolic rate, their physical activity, be it purposeful or non-purposeful, so exercise or non-exercise activity, or in like their thermic effective food, which is really small compared to the other ones.
2 or 3% at the most. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the problem with this study is based on their pre-registered trial. We know that they took body weight. We know they took body composition. Neither of those were reported. If they were really seeing this increase in energy expenditure, I mean, it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do doubly labeled water on these folks. How much does it cost to slide a scale under their feet?
Yeah.
Why is that data not reported? So, I mean, because if you really saw a 400 calorie per day difference, there should be weight loss. There will absolutely be weight loss with that. And so I'm skeptical based on that. They did report their BMR, their basal metabolic rate, which was not different between groups. They reported their physical activity was not different between groups. So where is this massive increase in energy expenditure coming from? I mean, you're basically left with TEF, and TEF as a whole probably doesn't even make up 400 calories a day, let alone the fact that protein is the most powerful macronutrient to affect TEF. And even if you double protein, you only get about 100 calories more per day of TEF. So it just doesn't make sense. They don't have a good explanation for where this increase in energy expenditure comes from. And then he also did a meta-analysis where they basically, it was a reanalysis of a meta-analysis that was done that basically said there's no difference in energy expenditure between low-carb diets or high-carb diets when protein and calories are matched. I referenced it earlier. It's by Kevin Hall. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, they just weren't low-carb adapted. And apparently according to them, there's some big increase in energy expenditure once you become low-carb adapted.
I think it's the opposite.
Right. So actually, Kevin Hall's study suggested it was the opposite. It suggested there was actually an increase in energy expenditure small, like 50 to 100 calories a day during the initial adaptation. But after about a week, that went away. So long story short, he separated this meta-analysis into short-term studies, which were shorter than 17 days, or long-term studies, which were longer than 17 days. Never gave a really good validation for why 17 days was chosen. Yeah. But basically he showed that in the long-term days, that energy expenditure was higher amongst low-carb diets.
Yeah.
Okay. But when you look at the way they had conducted the meta-analyses, when both metabolic chamber data and doubly labeled water data were available, they only used the doubly labeled water data. Now, that does not make any sense to me. So if you're telling me you have DEXA and calipers available, you chose to use the calipers. Why? You're using the surrogate measurement instead of the direct measurement. That doesn't make sense. And so, because what you're looking at is if it's longer than 17 days, most of the studies on energy expenditure are going to be with doubly labeled water and not metabolic chamber because you can't house people for very long in a metabolic chamber because you have to pay them because you're basically keeping them in food jail. Yeah. And once again, I actually went through those studies, like every single study, and looked at the ones that actually reported like weight and body composition. And the funny thing is, even the ones reporting differences in energy expenditure did not show differences in weight or body composition. So what do we care about? Do we care about this random number showing energy expenditure, or do we care about actual fat loss or weight loss?
Yeah.
And that, I mean, to me, I care about fat loss and weight loss, right? So I'm not saying that there's nefarious things are going on or anything like that. What I'm saying is if you want to get the answer to the question, you have to ask the right question, and then you have to design the study appropriately to answer that question.
Yeah, and and to shed light on like why someone when they're first starting a low carb or keto diet might end up having an increase in their metabolic rate, even just, I think it ended up being refuted more to probably like 60 to 40 maybe versus I think it was like 135 to 150 or something that was purported. But it generally comes from it's a hormetic stressor. I mean, you're stressing your body. So to that degree, that level of adaptation is going to take some energy. And so that's just to give context, just for people that are watching or listening. That's not surprising. And one of the things that I try to explain that is very important is that you still want a level of efficiency to some point. I think there's this like infatuation with inefficiency because people think that inefficiency automatically means that you're magically incinerating calories into thin air. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's arguments with uncoupling proteins and with ketones and uncoupling proteins. The data is kind of all over the place, and a lot of it, it's going to be in cultured cells, so it's really difficult to look at, right? Or in rodent models where you see brown fat increases and things like that. And there's been increases in like mitochondrial respiration, but what's interesting is increases in mitochondrial respiration, but no changes in ATP, which could explain some things, like, right? You're not having an increase in actual energy. You're having an increase in just possibly uncoupling proteins that are just dissipating energy as heat. But it all comes at a certain cost. It's not magically vanishing into thin air. and having to look at someone that is truly fat adapted, and I know that's a term that's thrown around a lot, but when you look at someone that has been doing keto for 6 months, 12 months, and you actually start to see some legitimate changes in terms of how their mitochondria utilize ketones or utilize fats, then that kind of tails off, and you start to see, okay, it kind of comes back to a baseline efficiency, and then at that rate, it just simply does come down to what works best for you. And for me, as someone that was an endurance athlete prior to being very overweight, I guess I should give context here. I was very overweight before. I was 100 pounds overweight, and yes, I was still hitting the gym. I still had some muscle on me, but keto worked for me when nothing else really would, because I'm one of those guys that if I start having carbs, I turn into a carb monster. Like, I'm just one of those guys, and meaning like I get the taste of it and I go for it. So keto just worked well for me for that. I'm long past the stages where I'm trying to prevent weight regain and things like that. For me, it's all about what works for me from a performance standpoint. And I was an endurance athlete before I was overweight, before I was ever into strength training and things like that. So that kind of makes sense in terms of the efficiency as far as the body utilizing fats as a fuel source during that point in time. Like, obviously beta oxidation, you're using fats anyway during certain stages of aerobic activity. I want
to point out real quick that any of that stuff is totally possible, because people will send me stuff like, mitochondrial uncoupling and respiration and whatnot. They'll say, what do you think? Like, this is, this what I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's totally possible. But again, remember, if it's having a big impact on fat loss, we're going to see that show up in actual fat loss, right? Yeah. So that's why I think it's important for people to always remember that, uncoupling proteins matter, all this stuff matters, but it's still going to show up in calories in, calories out in one way or another. Yeah. And so...
Totally true. Totally
true. Right.
And
so, and with regards to the initial bump in inefficiency, part of it too may be also that you tend to eliminate more ketones in urine initially. Yep. And so you're losing some calories that way as well. But yeah, to me, the argument that, okay, somehow at 17 days, this magically flips that you actually burn more calories, that seems weird and you don't really see that in other metabolic processes, right?
Yeah.
So it tends to be the opposite. And even if you're switching to a really high carb diet from a low carb diet, there's probably some inefficiency.
I was just going to say, you probably see similar things. Yeah, and not to interject, but I mean, what I've fallen in sort of in love with this whole thing, and I think it comes full circle, is you kind of have to fall in love with the stressor aspect of it, right? Because you same kind of thing. I caught a lot of flack for this one too, because it sounded like I was raining on the keto crowd, but it's very true. If you're going keto for an extended period of time, there is a level of glucose intolerance that happens. Okay, it's just your mitochondria learns how to use a given substrate. If you don't use it, you lose it in a certain fashion. And glucose intolerance can absolutely occur, and it's one of the reasons why when people are keto for a very strict amount of time, and then all of a sudden they binge on a bunch of carbohydrates, a bunch of refined starches, they feel extraordinarily bad, and because you're literally running headfirst into a massive inefficiency, and that's going to trigger heaven knows what, right? So, but being able to sort of embrace that is one of the things that makes it awesome, right? We embrace going to the gym and pushing ourselves against a stressor. We embrace periods of, in my world, fasting as a hormetic stressor. Even strategic gaps in between meals. When you actually log your food and track your food and you don't eat for 3 hours or 4 hours after eating, you'd be surprised. People think, oh, I'm eating 6 square meals a day. Okay, well, and I still lost weight. Yes, absolutely. But have you ever stopped to think that maybe because you're tracking and you're eating 6 very defined meals that you're not snacking in between those meals? And that's a huge player. And
yeah, they've actually shown that just structured, regimented food intake, regardless of tracking, will actually lower calorie intake. So if you eat in a structured manner, it actually lowers calorie intake typically.
That makes perfect sense. And I guess my words of wisdom, for whatever they're worth, are, take these things that you see from these models, these studies, and do what you want with them, but use them as motivation, use them as inspiration for whatever you want to do. I'd say, a lot of the content on my channel is there just to keep people going, right? People that are doing low carb, they want to hear about this stuff because it gives them that extra juice to keep it going. And, you know, I feel like that's the case for whatever you're doing. You know, if you're a vegan, you probably get your rocks off a little bit by finding a new study that looks like it rains on meat consumption, right? So if that's what keeps you going, then that's okay. You just got to keep it in check too. And I guess my point with the whole hormetic stressors and everything like that, I mean, that's just, I'm into that stuff, right? I feel like maybe it's a little bit of, I like torturing myself. I like my ice baths. I like saunas. I like that stuff because it's a stressor and it feels good. And I can't help but feel like when you're up against some kind of stressor, there is an adaptation that's going to occur. And that's a stressor on the body just in its very sense, right? So of course you're going to be up against some kind of adaptation or inefficiency that's going to temporarily increase metabolic rate for whatever reason. It doesn't mean it's going to stick forever. It doesn't mean that if you go and you hit that sauna at 200 degrees every single day, that you're going to get the same effect every single day. And I think it's just important for people to know that it's not none of this stuff is a magic pill. It's just how the body works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of stuff to unpack there. I think that, you know, it's interesting. I'll get people who DM me and say, well, you say this about this diet, but I felt great on it. I said, okay, so do it. And they'll be like, but you said you didn't like it. I said, no, that's not what I said. I said that it wasn't magic. I didn't say that you couldn't do it. You know, and I said, just be careful about recommending it to other people or telling other people what's going to happen, right? But again, you know, people say, Layne, do you think sauna can help you build muscle because, you know, X, Y, Z? And I say, no, but if you like it, go ahead and do it, right? Because if you feel good after that, I mean, it's funny. So a while back, I had a video series, and in one of the videos, like I was documenting my fat loss journey I was losing 30 pounds, dropping down a weight class in powerlifting. And so I would do a weekly like pose down basically to show like my progress. And I had cupping marks on me one week. And I got so many people who were like, how can you do that? That is not evidence-based, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, first off, I'm not making any claims about it. I never said that you should get cupping. I never said it was evidence-based. I never said it would do anything. You're just looking at me and making assumptions. And also, I just like the way it feels. And I can tell you that the literature doesn't really support it as having any kind of use or magic, but if I like the way it feels and I like getting massage and my massage therapist likes doing it, what's the skin off your back, right? So if somebody says to me, hey, you know, I did whatever, people think, you know, carnivore, for example. I feel good on it. You know, I've lost a bunch of weight. I would say, okay, well, maybe understands here's the downsides to that diet, but hey, you've lost some weight. You've kept it off. Like you're probably healthier than you were eating a bunch of junk food. So by all means, like it's better than the alternative for you, right? So, I mean, I tell people I'm kind of a diet agnostic, to be honest. Like I do what I do what I like. I talk about it to people who want to listen, and but I don't really care what diet you want to be on. But when people start making claims about certain diets they're on, that's when I'll, you know, kind of butt in, especially if people are kind of like driving that fear train or, you know, looking to make a profit off, you know, kind of scaring people over stuff. Because I think the other thing that's really missed here, and maybe people don't understand why I get so passionate about this stuff, is I see how common, maybe not eating disorders, but disordered eating or food anxiety is. Yeah. And it's like people think that like if they have, you know, a half a bite of an apple, they're going to, have a enlarged liver within 5 minutes, you know, because they had an apple. And it's like, no, dude, you guys can, you know, you mostly eat anything. You got to be reasonable with the portion sizes and how often you do it. But, you know, it's difficult to determine health because health is such a nebulous term. And I think one of the really uncomfortable facts that people don't want to hear is, you know, the best diet for preventing cardiovascular disease might not be the best diet for looking fit.
That's true.
Maybe it is. I don't know, right? And maybe the best diet for cancer is not the best diet for Alzheimer's. And maybe the best diet for Alzheimer's is not the best diet for cardiovascular disease or whatever it is, right? Like, it's going to depend on your goals. And I think we're going to learn in the future, like, hey, sure, like if your goal is this, maybe this, but then there's also this. And, I saw this thing, it was referring to politics, but I think it's also true of nutrition. And the quote was, there are no solutions, just trade-offs. And I think that that's very, very true.
Yeah.
And so I think when you approach it with that perspective and you understand that, okay, there's always going to be positives and negatives to whatever approach you pick. You just need to decide, do the positives outweigh the negatives based on your particular goals and what you want to accomplish and what makes sense for you?
100%, man. I got into this same thing talking about marriage versus being single with someone. It was
a trade-off.
Like it's just like, well, I've been with my wife since high school, right? So I've really never been with any other woman. And I believe it or not, I catch flack. I guess in today's society, that's not cool. I don't know. But it's, so, and it's respectful, right? People will say, well, that's, okay, well, again, same thing. Like, what are the trade-offs? Okay, I have someone to come home
Well, Thomas,
to.
if I can interrupt you, I've only ever been with two women in my entire life, my ex-wife and my current wife. So I vibe with that a little bit. You know what
Totally,
I mean?
man.
Like, it's very rare.
It is rare, and it's maybe for us that's what jives with us. That's what works, and there's certainly people out there that would be a huge trade-off that they would, oh, you mean that I can't go out and sleep around or do whatever I want to do or okay, well, it's a trade-off, but that trade-off doesn't really matter to me because I strongly prefer having someone to go home to at night and be with and companionship. And so it's the same kind of thing.
And all that kind of thing.
Exactly, man. It's just like there's just these trade-offs, and I think I respect you a lot because I feel like what comes through sometimes in short clips, if people just watch short clips, or people might just watch your rebuttal videos, or they don't like sit back and actually consume your content. And I consumed your content long before I was ever even a large brand online. And I've known where you've come from and known where you stand. And I know we have to wrap this up because this is going on for a long time. And guys, like down below in the comments, if you want us to do a part 2, by all means, be happy to. And I'm sure there's a lot of cool stuff we could cover. But you mentioned something, and I want to make sure I touch on it, is that you and I both being in the fitness industry, I think we can both attest to the fact that just because someone looks a certain way does not mean that they are healthy on the inside. And in an industry where everything it's largely not healthy. But again, who are we to say it's healthy or not? It's just, the point is that coming in that industry, you see it all the time. And man, there's a couple things I wanted to make sure I touched on, but I will touch on one more thing, I promise, and then we'll wrap it up. But
it's all right.
Something that I agree with you on, that I mentioned in another video, it was the saturated fat piece, and I don't think we need to go into detail on it. But people forget that with keto, the ability to overeat is a lot easier. So you have to be extra careful, right? Because people think that consuming a fat bomb, because it's fat and it's not a carbohydrate, it's not going to make them fat. Well, you're pulling a much bigger lever, gram for gram, by having that fat bomb than you would be by having a Sour Patch Kid. Now, I'm not saying you go have a Sour Patch Kid. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying gram to calories, like how much the food volume is with how many calories it has. Like if you overeat on that, you bet your bottom dollar you're going to gain fat. And at the end of the day, and this still gets discounted a lot, is that fat will still store as fat very easily. In fact, it actually stores easier than carbs as fat because it's more similar. It doesn't have to go through a process to turn into fat. So you mentioned that, and it's tough because I catch so much flack for that, but it's real. And on keto, in a lot of ways, you have to be you do need to track, you do need to look at things because you're not absolved of that simply because you're not consuming carbohydrates. It's easier to mess up. And I guess you could say like Spider-Man with, great power comes great responsibility. If you're willing to kind of, go down the keto route and you're trying to optimize for that and you're into that, then great. But it comes with responsibility too. It's not like you can just live this flagrant life and do whatever you want.
Yeah, I think just like you can eat a really nutrient-dense, minimally processed plant-based diet, you can eat a really nutrient-dense, minimally processed ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
But, people want to say, well, keto has appetite-suppressing effects. Yeah, But appetite suppression is very dependent on the individual foods.
Very much so,
dependent on the individual foods. And actually the foods of the unprocessed foods or minimally processed foods, fat foods tend to be more easy to overeat compared to carb foods.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the highest ranking food on a satiety scale is a plain baked potato, right?
Yeah.
To make a plain baked potato really, really good, you got to add salt and butter and all this other stuff, right? Grab a handful of nuts. You can do that all day, right?
Yeah.
In fact, there's a funny story. Dom D'Agostino, who's one of the leading ketogenic diet researchers, even talked about how one of his family members put on 30 pounds during keto because they were eating a bunch of bacon and butter and grease and whatnot. And it's like, their LDL went crazy and they put on quite a bit of weight. And it's like, you still have to be in an energy deficit, but keto can help with that because it does appear to have some appetite suppressing effects. And then even, I don't know if you're familiar with Ethan Suplee. I think he was on your show.
Yeah, I had him. He's awesome. Yeah.
So Ethan talked about how he got stuck at a certain point. Like he lost a lot of weight on keto, and then he kind of got stuck, and he thought it was because the lettuce in his salad, when in reality it was the fact that he was dumping olive oil on his salad, right? Yeah. So I think that's a really important point to make, but the same, it's funny because ketogenic people will criticize vegan diets. It's like, oh, well, beer and French fries are vegan. You can be plant-based and eating a bunch of crap. Yeah. Well, you can be keto and eating a bunch of crap too. You know what I mean? And again, I don't want to fear-monger processed food. There's nothing inherently evil about food processing other than the fact that it makes it much more palatable and easy to overeat. In some cases, it does, put more saturated fat in the food, which can have some independent health issues. But, I would say if you want to have some processed food, you can, it's fine. But you have to understand that it's going to be much more difficult to moderate that, especially if you're not tracking your calories. I would say to people, if you don't want to track calories, you better be willing to mostly stick to minimally processed foods. If you want to include some processed food, you probably can, but it's going to be much easier to do so if you're tracking, because then you can get a good estimation of how much portion size you can have. And that's a big thing that people miss. So I think a great point that you bring up. And again, any different kind of diet can help you lose weight, but a lot of it boils down to, what kind of diet quality do you have? Because that diet quality impacts your satiety and impacts how you feel and how much you can move and those sorts of things. And all that stuff's really important.
Yeah, no, without a doubt, man. I mean, 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, when I started keto, there wasn't a lot of hyper-palatable keto goodies out there. So, I lost weight very fast, but by default, when I was doing keto, because the carbs were gone for me, there weren't a whole lot of processed options for me. So my default was to go to whole foods, right? And I'm very open about that on my channel, that it was probably easier for me to have success than would I have the same success now. People ask me all the time, if you were the same weight now, would you still do keto? That's a really difficult question, right? Because my large part of my adult life has been keto, right? So I would probably say, yeah, I like it, but
just look at the keto ice creams. They're double the amount of calories as the regular ice cream, right?
Yep. I tell people if they have a cheat meal, that's a very good point. They're on keto, they want to have a cheat meal. So they go and they pick up the keto ice creams. Saying if you're going to have a cheat meal, because trust me, and go get the regular ice cream or go get the Halo Top non-keto ice cream, because it's a heck of a lot lower calories. And if you're having a cheat meal, you're having a dang cheat meal. So just do it, right? And it's because you're going to end up consuming half the amount of calories than if you just consumed the keto ice cream. It's just some of this common sense stuff. I think it needs to be brought back. Otherwise, my concern, honestly, is that there's a lot of good stuff coming out of the keto world. A lot of good stuff coming out of Oxford, a lot of good stuff coming out with the use of exogenous ketone esters in different performance settings. And it's cool stuff, right? There's cool stuff that's coming out. And it's exciting, at least for me. But a lot of it's going to end up getting destroyed by outlandish claims and by weird things that are said. And it's just we have to bring back a little bit of normalcy to how we talk about keto and how it's addressed.
Yeah, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Yeah, precisely.
I think that there's absolutely some therapeutic effects of a ketogenic diet. I was just looking over some studies on, while it doesn't necessarily, at least in the few studies that have looked at it in healthy people, it doesn't appear to necessarily improve cognition, although some people say that they feel better on it, which again, perfectly reasonable reason to do it. There appear to be pretty strong evidence for improving Alzheimer's symptoms, dementia, as well as especially epilepsy, because actually the ketogenic diet originally came into being because of epilepsy, because it's a really great epilepsy treatment. And so, again, if you're epileptic, talk to your doctor first, all that good stuff. But once again, I really think that it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I've seen some people even they're so against the extreme claims of keto that they go too far the other way, and they kind of poo-poo the ketogenic diet for anything. And it's like, well, that's not a good idea either. Like, let's say, there may be some unique effects of this diet. So, as far as fat loss, probably not, but for other things, absolutely. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that's really important. Yeah,
I love that, man. I mean, that's a great way to put it, because if keto works for you for losing fat, great, okay. But where I stand is it's not the holy grail of fat loss. For me, it's a lot of different aspects that I enjoy about it. There are a bunch of different ways that I could maintain body composition, that I could maintain my level of leanness. No questions asked. That is on record, right? I like keto because of the other attributes that I feel I get from it. And yeah, it's exactly. I think the most compelling stuff is coming out of the brain world. I mean, network stability. I mean, interesting stuff there, to say the least. And it's, being researched in different defense practicalities and everything too. So it's just awesome.
Yeah,
and I'm glad
Navy divers helps prevent seizures at depth. Yep,
exactly. And it's just cool to see that research coming out. And I know Dom's a big part of that. And And I appreciate being able to have a cordial discussion. I know, we'll piss a few people off, but it's all good, because this is, I think, where things need to go. I think we need to be able, like you said, reach across the aisle, get insight, realize that people aren't bad people. They're just usually a lot of times trying to make a buck. They're trying to, I always say, a squirrel trying to get a nut. But if you're actually able to have conversations with people and level with them, or willing to have those conversations, and that's how we actually grow, and that's how we actually motivate and inspire and keep stuff rocking.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not too proud to admit that, it's very hard to get eyeballs on your stuff if you're not doing extreme things, right? Like if you're, it's a big open world in social media, and in a way you have to be allowed voice. And, one of the ways I've been able to generate more views on my channel is by tackling some of these big myths. And some of that is through tackling the people that perpetuate the big myths. And, it's one of those things where it's like, I don't want to cross that line. I kind of go right up to the line, but I still want to make sure that I'm presenting things in a, it's always like, it's funny. My editor and I will sit there and like, all right, what's the sexiest title we can make this that still isn't crossing the line on misrepresenting what this actually says, right? And that's tough. And that's probably why I have 200,000 subscribers on YouTube. And I get so many comments like, how does this channel not have 1 million or 2 million subscribers? And I'm like, well, probably because I don't go past a certain point. But, I'm hoping that over time, the resiliency will build and that prevail. Sort of thing. Yeah. And, but again, I'm not too proud to admit that I still probably am more aggressive than I should be at times when I'm calling people out.
Man, and it's going to get even crazier with, I don't know what your personal feelings on it, but with like TikTok and stuff like that, it just frustrates me, because you can't, it's just claims and everything. It's just going to be the Wild West again. And
I love TikTok. It's an endless source of content for me.
I can't even do it. It's like people ask, I just can't, because it's just like, it's not, I don't know. It's going to open up just a giant can of worms. And like I've said this before, like I'm waiting for the day that the FTC and FDA comes like raining hard down on influencers. That it's because when the TikTok world, it's getting way out of hand. And YouTube, yes, you can have a certain degree of like a little bit of a claimy, outlandish title, because you can actually back it up with a 20-minute video, and not even say back it up, but you can explain yourself in a 20-minute video, and people might understand, like, okay, I understand that title and thumbnail is to get clicks, but when you actually look at the video, okay, this is what it's about. TikTok, what are you going to say in 15 seconds? Like, you're basically making this claim, and you're title and thumbnail and reinforcing it in a 15-second video. So it's very frustrating. And I know we share probably the same sentiments about, YouTube can be very frustrating because people don't get the full picture, because they try to serve people a piece of content they think they want, and then it's taken out of context because they're not reaching the whole thing, getting the whole picture of something you've said before. It's frustrating. And,
social media is tough, and I tell people, I'm like, just be careful what you wish for in terms of censorship, like in terms of, I've gotten people saying like, don't you wish the government would just crack down on these people like, making these claims? And I'm like, I tend to be somebody who I think self-policing is better policing. And the only reason why is you think it'll work out how you want with regulations, but in reality, it's probably going to hurt everybody. As an example, like what if the government said tomorrow, you're not allowed to give dietary advice unless you're a registered dietitian because that's who we consider the experts. Well, I've got a PhD in nutrition, but I'm not a registered dietitian. Yeah. So now I've either got to go become an RD or I've got to stop talking about this stuff. Yeah. And I mean, you're basically trusting that either these social media platforms or the government are equipped to figure out who actually the experts are. And I don't think that that's necessarily true because they're just made up of people like every other organization.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're prone to the same biases and nonsense as anybody else. So I still think that, I see what I do as kind of a service because I look at myself as kind of like being as involved in the checks and balances of things. And I think that that's a better way to do it than having, somebody arbitrarily come in and shut people down.
Totally agree.
I'm not, people were, I know, there was Paul Saladino, I think he got his Instagram removed a while back, and people were like, oh, aren't you happy about this? And I'm like, not really, because, it's him today, but tomorrow it could be me. You know what I mean? Yeah. So
it's an indicator.
I think you got to be careful with that sort of stuff.
We definitely share the same sentiments there. And, and on that note, I mean, everyone that's a subscriber to my channel, I encourage you to go subscribe to Layne's channel. Like, even if you don't agree with everything that he has to say, I'm sure there are things that you do agree with. So go give him a follow, help his channel grow. Because I'm actually surprised too that you don't have more subscribers, but I also get it. It's saturated anyway. But
well, go subscribe, and if you guys don't like me, leave a comment and help me get that engagement. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I mean, and this thing is like, even if you don't agree with them, get both sides, right? I always, even politically, watch CNN and watch Fox, right? Watch both, always see both sides so that you understand where each side is coming from, and you can think with a little bit of autonomy there. It's important that you also have your own say with what you're doing with your nutrition, and if you take information from one side and one side only, that's not going to help you much. You got to look at the whole equation. So, man, we've been running for like 2 hours, so I think for the few that have distilled down to here, I think we've got some diehards, and I'm sure they'll go subscribe.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you having me on, man, and hopefully people enjoyed it and it helped them out. And if you want round 2, let me know. I'd be happy to do it. Yeah, post it down in the comment section. And where can everyone find you? So the central hub is biolayne.com. You can find everything we do there. I'm BioLayne on pretty much all social media platforms, and then our app you referred to earlier, Carbon Diet Coach, is available on iOS and Android. All you got to do is search Carbon Diet Coach or go to joincarbon.com. Perfecto. Cool, man. Well, as always, everyone, keep it locked in. We'll see you guys soon. Cool. Cool.